notes when I took mine. Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Rob Frost, the chairman of the Republican Party of Cuyahoga County, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, author and former Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to George W. Bush, Karl Rove. Now, historians, yeah, you can clap there, that's fine. Historians mark President William McKinley's 1896 victory over William Jennings Bryan as ending a period of political gridlock, not unlike the era we're living through now. Now, McKinley's election brought on a period of political reform and GOP dominance that lasted more than 3 decades. Let's hope we have that repeat as well. A smattering of applause. One of America's best-known political strategists, Karl Rove, tells this election story in his new book, The Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters. Mr. Rove served President George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007. At the White House, he oversaw the offices of Strategic Initiatives, Political Affairs, Public Liaison, and Intergovernmental Affairs, and was Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, coordinating the White House policymaking process. He has been described by author and columnist Michael Barone in the U.S. News and World Report as, quote, unique. No presidential appointee has ever had such a strong influence on politics and policy, and none is likely to do so again anytime soon. Washington Post columnist and, Fred Barnes, executive editor of the Weekly Standard, has called him the greatest mind of his generation, greatest political mind of any generation, the greatest political mind of his generation and probably any generation. He knows history, understands the moods of the public, and is a visionary on matters of policy. Mr. Rove became known as the architect of President Bush's 2000 and 2004 campaigns. Before that, he was president of Karl Rove and Company, an Austin-based public affairs firm that worked for Republican candidates, nonpartisan causes, and nonprofit groups. His clients included over 75 Republican U.S. Senate, congressional, and gubernatorial candidates in 24 states, as well as the moderate party of Sweden. These days, Mr. Rove writes a weekly op-ed for the Wall Street Journal and is the author of not only his recently released book that he will discuss today, but also of the New York Times bestseller, Courage and Consequence, My Life as a Conservative in the Fight. He now serves on the University of Texas Chancellor's Council Executive Committee, as well as numerous other civic and nonprofit boards. He was inducted into the Scandinavian American Hall of Fame in 2009 and the American Association of Political Consultants Hall of Fame in 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club, please join me in welcoming Mr. Karl Rove.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob, for that incredibly long and boring introduction. I'm honored to be here, but I only have one question. After 103 years in business, is this the best you can do? I mean, really, you show up for the most minor of traveling salesmen. I noticed when Dan asked how many of you were at the event last night with Senator Booker, who's a really fine human being, a number of you raised your hands, and my advice to you is get professional help now. I mean, you've got to get a life. I mean, showing up for visiting Paul's is not ennobling, but anyway, thanks for doing it. I'm also honored that this year in the Cleveland International Film Festival, I understand you've really been international. You've accepted some films by Texas filmmakers, and I really want to thank you for it. Now, just remember, the accents will be a little difficult to understand at first, but pay close attention, and we think you'll get the symbolism. Rob mentioned political gridlock, and we got broken political system, and we have all kinds of economic disruption that is creating enormous anxiety among particularly blue-collar Americans, and we have the country transforming in front of our eyes, changing from one thing into something distinctly different, and we are at the end of the second term of an somewhat unpopular Democratic president. You may have think I'm talking about today, but I'm actually talking about 1896. I didn't set out to write this book. The Triumph of William McKinley, available at Amazon.com. Because I wanted to draw parallels, I set out to write a durable history of one of the least understood major elections in American history. I studied it in political science and taught it. Some of you may have read V.O. Key's famous 1954 essay on realigning elections, or studied Walter Dean Burnham's great work on the realigning elections, or had it taught to you in political science. There have been 5 moments in American history where the political system, the political structure, the politics of America is one way before a presidential election and distinctly different in the period after. And 4 of those elections we talk about by talking about the author of that change. 1800 and Thomas Jefferson, the end of the Federalist era and the birth of Democratic Republicans. 1828, the second American party system, the modern American political party under Andrew Jackson. 1860 and the emergence of the Republicans under Abraham Lincoln. 1932, FDR and the New Deal. But 1896, we talk more about the guy who lost the election, William Jennings Bryan, and about the guy who follows McKinley in office, and we overlook this remarkable man, the 25th President of the United States, whom most people do not understand and do not know, except as he's one guy between Grover Cleveland and Theodore Roosevelt, and got shot. But as I set out to write the book, first of all, I was incredibly drawn to the fact that there are so many parallels. The American political system then was broken. We have 5 presidential elections in a row leading up to 1896 in which nobody gets 50% of the vote. Nobody. America is so divided that nobody can get a majority. During that period, 2 out of those 5 elections result in somebody winning the Electoral College but losing the popular vote. And one of those elections involves a 5-month-long dispute about the electoral votes of Florida. We have a third presidential election. In which somebody wins the majority in the Electoral College and a plurality of the popular vote nationwide, 7,000 votes. You talk about gridlock today. During this period of 24 years, we have 2 years in which the Republicans have the White House, the House, and the Senate, and 2 years in which the Democrats have the White House, the House, and the Senate. And the rest of the 20 years, it's divided government, and the 2 parties hate each other. Not simply because they have deeply divergent political philosophies. The Democratic Party, the party of states' rights and limited government and low taxes through low tariffs, and basically wiping out the black and white Republican vote in the South. And the Republican Party stands for a robust national government and high taxes through high tariffs and protecting the rights of black and white Republicans in the South. But they're also still fighting the Civil War. It's not merely that they got different ideas about how to govern, they still are fighting the conflict in which 600,000 Americans died. When the Democrats take control of the House in 1874, for the first time since 1857, it's called the Victory of the Brigadiers, because so many Confederate officers are elected to Congress. And they're fighting out that war 30 years afterwards in Congress. 1890, the Republicans take control of the House of Representatives and elect Thomas Brackett Reed of Maine as the Speaker. 6 foot 3 inches tall, weighs 300 pounds, looked like a bowling pin with a walrus mustache. Brilliant, acerbic, cynical. The Democrats announced this back when they were civilized. They didn't meet until the following fall. So in the fall of 1891, the House meets, and the Democrats announced they will not allow a single bill to be brought up on the floor of the House. They don't say, oh, you got to repeal Obamacare or we're going to shut down the government. They say, we don't care what you want to do, we're not going to do it. We will refuse to answer the roll call and thereby deny the House a quorum to conduct business. After a couple of fruitless days of roll calls, at the end of one, Reed says very quietly, calmly, the chair directs the secretary to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, calls out every Democrat standing on the floor of the House who's refused to answer the roll call, and directs the clerk to show them present, thereby giving the House a quorum and the ability to conduct business. One Democrat stands up and says, under God and the Constitution, you have no right to count me present on the floor of the House. Reed says, the chair is merely stating a fact. Does the honorable gentleman from Kentucky deny he's present on the floor? This kicks off a 3-month-long debate in Congress as to whether or not the Speaker has the right to do this that ultimately ends in the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the meantime, nothing gets done. And it's acrimonious. In the opening debate, William Henry Howdy Martin of Texas stands up, 6'6" tall, thin as a rail, mean as a snake. Fought the entire Civil War as a staff officer in the famed Hood's Brigade. He stands up on the floor of the House, points to the speaker on the podium and says, "If any member will order me to remove this dictator from his position upon the podium, I will do so by force forthwith." Reed says, "The honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order," and moves on. Howdy Martin of Athens, Texas is so irritated he starts sitting every day right in front of Reed, pulling out his 16-inch long Bowie knife and methodically sharpening it on his boot sole in order to menace the Speaker of the House. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not remember Nancy Pelosi doing this with her stilettos in 2011. And the economy is being riven by changes that are hard for us to fully comprehend and understand. We think we live in a time of economic change. We think we worry about a world that's global in nature and what it means to our jobs and our economy. But think about an age in which they've created the electric light bulb and electric engines and automobiles and refrigerated rail cars and drawn the nation together by iron rails and have got so many new mechanical ways to make things that every artisan, the man who used to make a tin plate and sell it for a quarter, now has to compete with a gigantic stamping machine that puts it out at a speed and a pace and a uniformity that's impossible for him to match. Think about being a farmer who in the 1860s or 70s is worried about making enough to feed his family and having enough at the end of the season to sell for the market for the adjoining area. And now he has to worry about what's the state of the Ukrainian wheat crop and how are they doing in Australia and what's the cotton crop looking like in Egypt. We're now part of a global market in which prices that are set across the globe in ways that make it deeply dangerous for people as they contemplate their future. They're worried, is there a place for me in this society? Is there a fairness? Why are some people getting ahead and some of us working hard and falling behind? It's also an age in which the country is being transformed. We were a nation of immigrants. We always have been. But through the 1860s and 1870s, the immigration had been mostly coming from familiar places: England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Germany. But starting in the 1870s, we began attracting people from strange places on the globe. Some Ukrainian wheat farmer, or a Polish tailor, or a Bohemian beer maker, or a potter from Italy, or a tanner from Spain, and a Greek fisherman. We began to be overrun by people who didn't look like Americans. And the anxiety that people had about this was enormous. And the politics is broken. And along comes this election in which a son of Ohio, whom nobody really knows, I am blown away by him. We honor JFK for PT 109. We honor 41 for enlisting at the age of 18 and becoming the youngest torpedo bomber pilot in the Navy in World War II. William McKinley, at the age of 18, shows up with the Poland militia at Camp Jackson outside of Columbus. Lincoln has called for 90-day volunteers. In 90 days, we'll end this rebellion. And they arrive. And they're told, sorry, the quota for 90 days has been filled. Your choice is to enlist for 3 years or the duration, whichever is longer, or go home. And almost to a man, the young men, the teenagers of the Poland militia enlist, and William McKinley enters the 23rd Ohio as a private in April of 1861. He ends the war in April of 1865 as a major, having received 3 battlefield commissions for unspeakable, unbelievable valor. He is recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor and dissuades his comrades from pressing the application, saying, "I was merely doing my duty." And what a duty he thought he had. He's on 2 suicide missions, the first of which he chooses for himself in September of 1862. He's a commissary sergeant, meticulous, well-organized, a lot of integrity, so he's put in charge of the supplies. So he is comfortably in the rear when the 23rd Ohio goes into battle on the bloodiest day of the Civil War, Antietam. At 2 a.m. in the morning, they go into action. And by 2 p.m., 12 hours later, they have fought their way across a 700 or 800 yard open field, raked by Confederate musket and cannon fire, and taken the stone bridge, and are now sheltered under a bluff on the other side, awaiting orders to attack Sharpsburg. And they've taken horrible casualties. And McKinley has seen this comfortably behind the front lines. Finally, the supply train shows up. and he decides he must resupply his men. They've not had anything to eat or drink since the previous night. So he commandeers a wagon, loads it with tins of coffee, boiled meat, and hardtack, and begins to make his way to the front. An officer comes upon him and says, "What are you attempting to do?" He says, "I'm resupplying the 23rd. He says, "Turn around. You will have to cross an open field in which there are only dead men." McKinley says, "I've got to go forward in this wooded area and find a place big enough to turn around," and waits until the officer rides off and then continues to make his way forward with no intention of turning around. Second officer comes up with staff aides, has the same conversation, orders McKinley to turn around. McKinley waits until he rides off and then whips the horses and comes bursting out of the tree line, and all hell breaks loose. The Confederates can't believe themselves. What idiot is trying to drive a wagon across this open field? A cannon shell takes off the back of the wagon. Bullets are flying everywhere. Somehow or another, McKinley makes it through, though. The hand of God protects him, and he comes rolling over the bridge, and I wish I could have been there. The eyewitness accounts say when McKinley comes across that bridge, the men of the 23rd Ohio stand as one and cheer the 19-year-old commissary sergeant. Makes his way among the gravely wounded, gives one of them a cup of coffee, probably the last cup of coffee that guy ever had, and he says to McKinley, "God bless you, lad." McKinley later said it was the greatest reward he could have ever had. And this is only the first suicide mission he goes on. The second one he's ordered 2 years later when he's a second lieutenant, his brigade commander. The brigade has been attacked by Jubal Early outside of Kernstown, Virginia, and the Union line begins to crumple, and the brigade commander orders a retreat of the 5 regiments under his control. But as they retreat, they realize the 13th West Virginia on the extreme end of the Union line has not gotten the order, and it is in an orchard and about ready to be cut off and shot to pieces. And the brigade commander turns around and picks out his most dependable officer and says, "McKinley, ride to the 13th West Virginia and get him out of there," requiring McKinley to ride in front of the Union line as it's retreating, riding ever closer to the Confederates. His tent mate said, it was a suicide mission. And McKinley gets on his horse and is riding across an open battlefield with shells going off everywhere. One goes off right next to him. And his tent mate, Russell Hastings, said, "We thought he was gone." But he later wrote, "Out of the gray cloud came the small brown horse with the erect horseman." McKinley somehow or another makes it through to the 13th West Virginia. They withdraw, and just at the last instant, McKinley rides around the back of the Union lines, makes his way to his brigade commander's tent, walks in the tent. His brigade commander, Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, looks at him in astonishment and says, "My God, I never expected to see you in life again." And this is an amazing character. And the book is populated. The story of the 1896 election is populated with crazy characters. The Democratic nominee is not even a candidate for president, not considered a candidate for president 36 hours before he's the Democratic nominee. The Democratic Party repudiates the sitting Democratic president in the most vicious way and personal way possible, decrying Grover Cleveland's policies, and ironically enough, by repudiating the sitting Democrat president, free themselves from responsibility for the terrible depression the country's in. They can claim that the Republicans are in favor of the exact policies that brought about the depression, and they, the silver Democrats, are now freed from any responsibility for it. And they are on the way to victory. In July and August and early September of 1896, the Democrats, they don't conduct polls back then. They conduct canvasses. They literally go to every voter in every precinct, find out where they are, report it to the county chairman who aggregates the results and sends it to the state party. And in August of 1896, the Iowa Republican Party chairman says, "We're losing 25% of the Republican farm vote. We will lose dependable Iowa by a big margin." And reports like that are coming in across the country. And yet McKinley wins. And he wins because he runs the first modern presidential campaign and does something which is a great model for any candidate. He explains what the economic issues of that race are all about in terms that win the working class voter. Now, we find it hard to understand what the issue of gold versus silver is all about, and so it sounds sort of esoteric to us, but William Jennings Bryan did a great job of summarizing it in 3 sentences in the Cross of Gold speech. There are 2 ideas of government. Republicans believe if you just legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, then their prosperity will leak through on those below. Democrats believe if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up and through every class that rests upon it. Trickle-down economics was at the heart of the 1896 presidential race, and McKinley's genius was finding a voice, finding a way to talk about the issue so that he could carry the city of New York, when the factory wards and precincts of Baltimore and Philadelphia carried the stockyards in New York, in Chicago, and carried the labor vote in the mines and smelters and factories around the north and in the border states. But it's a great rollicking story. It's not just simply amorphous forces working their way through our society and through our culture and through the political structure of the country. It is mistakes of human beings and successes of human beings. It's real people making real decisions, some of them brilliant and some of them smart and some of them not. It's about the most amazing cast of characters. I mean, everybody's got a cool nickname. The boy orator, the Platte, the Napoleon of protection, the easy boss, the blonde boss, the southern cyclone, the Texas cyclone, and my personal favorite, the Democratic frontrunner for president, Richard Park Bland of Missouri, who for 20 years has led the fight in the U.S. House of Representatives for the free and unlimited coinage of silver, an inflationary currency that he calls the cause of humanity himself. Richard Bland's nickname is Silver Dick. I mean, you cannot make this stuff up. And what I also found out is that history's got it wrong. I hate to say it, but the role of one person in the election of 1896 is overblown. Cleveland's own Marcus Alonzo Hanna. He's important. He's the good friend of McKinley who wants to see him president. He's like Don Evans to George W. Bush or Terry McAuliffe to Bill Clinton. But he's not the manager of the campaign in the fall. On the critical decisions in the summer of 1896, on each and every one of them, he is wrong and McKinley is right. And in the 112 days of the general election, before cell phones, before fax machines, before video conferencing, he is on the road 70 of 140 days. 112 days, excuse me. The actual campaign manager turns 31, a young Ohioan, educated in law school in Cincinnati, who heads west to make his living as a frontier lawyer in Lincoln, Nebraska, where he practices law in a small office building with a lawyer 5 years his senior named William Jennings Bryan. And together, these two young men often have lunch, 15-cent lunch at Cameron's Diner with the ROTC instructor at the University of Nebraska, a young West Pointer named John J. Pershing. This kid meets McKinley in 1894, comes to Columbus and says, if you run for president, you're a reform-minded Republican who will modernize and change the Republican Party, and I'm for you. McKinley sees him again in October of 1894 in Lincoln when he's barnstorming the country during the midterm elections, and the kid says, I got Nebraska organized for you, I got friends in the Dakotas and in Wyoming, here's what I've been doing. And McKinley says, this kid's got it. The kid moves to Chicago in January of 1895 to become an entrepreneur, buying gas utilities and knitting them together and getting economies of scale, and wants to make himself a successful businessman. And Illinois is the critical contest on the road to the Republican nomination. New York, in the hands of the bosses. Pennsylvania, the second largest delegation, in the hands of the bosses. Ohio united behind McKinley tenuously because of McKinley's adept handling of Joseph Fire Alarm Foraker, one of the most undependable people in American politics I've ever seen. And the fourth largest delegation is Illinois. One of McKinley's advisors says it's the Gettysburg of the contest. So what does McKinley do? He puts the 30-year-old kid who's just moved to Chicago in charge of his campaign because he says the kid has what it takes, and he does. Meticulous, well organized, builds a card file of everybody in the country or everybody in the state, all 99 counties. He has 3 people working for him, another young man who's a streetcar conductor, and 2 Civil War generals, 30 years his elders, who come to have such enormous respect for the young man that they start calling him the general. And he is a general, and he organizes it. And when the Republicans meet in convention in Springfield in April of 1896 for what the Combine, the Republican bad guys call themselves the Combine expects an easy victory. Instead, they are smashed, losing 2-1 at the Illinois contest, thereby ending the race for the Republican nomination. And that night, McKinley sits down in his study in Canton, Ohio, and in his beautiful handwriting writes a note to the young man. I cannot close the day without sending you a message of appreciation and congratulations. There is nothing in all of this long campaign so signal and significant as the triumph at Springfield. I cannot find words to express my admiration for your high qualities of leadership. You have won exceptional honor. You had long ago won my heart. the son McKinley never had, who goes on, McKinley takes him to Washington, and at the age of 32, Charles G. Dawes becomes the comptroller of the currency, later becomes the first director of the very first Bureau of the Budget, Vice President of the United States, Ambassador to Great Britain, first head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and the fourth American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. But in 1894, when McKinley meets him, he's 28 years old, tall, thin, with red hair parted in the middle, and smokes a corncob pipe sideways, so he's always covered with ash. And McKinley says, the kid has what it takes. I'll tell you, this is a hell of a story. And everybody shows up. It's got twists and turns that are worthy of some coked-up Hollywood screenwriter. And it's all true. And everybody shows up, and there are lots of interesting characters. One of my favorite would make himself right at home in Ohio Democratic politics, Burke Cochran. He's an Irish-born Democrat from New York City. Not particularly attractive guy, sort of ordinary. I put his picture in the book because he is sort of ordinary. But he was born in County Galloway, and when he spoke, he had a wonderful Irish baritone. And men wanted to be his friend, and women wanted to be his lover when he spoke. And he took a lover in 1894. He'd gotten tossed out of Congress, and so he was become a wealthy New York lawyer. And so he took a lover, a British aristocratic widow, and he spent much of the next 2 years with her in Paris. Became quite close to her son. 19-year-old kid stayed with him the month of October 1895 en route to Cuba, where the young man was going to be a war correspondent for a London newspaper. And Burke broke his leg in April of 1896 and makes his way to Paris to recuperate in the arms of his lover, but something happens. And in July or August, early August, the affair ends. His 2-year-long affair with the widow ends, and he returns to the United States. And he sends word for the press to meet him at the dockside, and they do. And when he's there, he says, I'm a Democrat. I've always been a Democrat. I always will be a Democrat. But I also support honest money, the gold standard. And therefore, I can support neither the Democratic nominee or the Democratic platform. At my own expense, I will travel the country under the auspices of the Honest Money League to encourage like-minded Democrats to support William McKinley. And in an age of intense partisanship, this never happens. This is like John Connally saying, I was Lyndon's fair-haired boy, but I can't stomach McGovern. I'm going to go for Nixon in '72. And Cochran is immediately called upon to respond to a speech that William Jennings Bryan has given in New York City a week later, and he does. He gives a speech. It's an hour and a half long without a single note. I've read the speech. It is magnificent. You can hear the cheers of the crowd. I've got a transcript of it in which the crowd response is noted. Hit him again, hit him again. Standing cheers. The crowd rises in applause. You can just hear them do this with this speech. At the end of it, the easy boss, the Republican leader in New York, Thomas Collier Platt, says the election is over. Now, of course, they got 3 months long, more hard fight to make, but Cochran has done an extraordinary job. It's reprinted in newspapers all across the country. Reprinted in the London newspapers, where the son of his former lover reads it and immediately sends him a telegram. It was a magnificent address. I hope it will have a huge moral effect. Devotedly yours, Winston Spencer Churchill. In 1947, Churchill gives the Iron Curtain speech, and American admirer writes him and says, you are the greatest orator of our century. And he writes him back saying, no, I am not. Everything that I learned about the use of the English language, how to hold thousands in thrall, I learned at the feet of my mentor, Burke Cochran. It's a hell of a read. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks for having me. Thank you, man.
Well, today we are enjoying a forum with Karl Rove, author and former Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to George W. Bush. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via our webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. We want to remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. Holding the microphones today are Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg and Marketing and Outreach Fellow Faye Walker. May we have the first question, please?
If you go back to the beginning of the GOP primary season when there were 17 or 117 candidates, if you could have picked one to manage their campaign. Could you tell us which one and why you would have picked that candidate? Or if there was one that wasn't in the 17, who that might have been?
I got out of that business after doing it twice. I had hair and it was gray when I started. And look, you don't need to go back to the beginning of the process. You need to go back before the beginning of the process. In 1996, it looked like Bob Dole might not make it. And people started saying to the governor of Texas, you ought to think about running. And after the November defeat, he began thinking seriously about it. And we began then very seriously to lay the predicate for a run in 2000. And the most important thing was, he said, I want to go to school. I want to go to graduate school. I want to get the smartest people in America to come and talk to me about the most important things that the country faces. I want to read vociferously. I want to ask questions. I want to have people that, I don't want to press them to be for me, but I want them to press them to give me their best counsel. And George W. Bush spent the next 3 years, 97, 98, and 99, preparing himself mentally for the task of running for president. About this much of it was politics, and about this much of it was fundraising, and about this much of it was understanding the challenges that he might face if we were elected president. And it made him fluent. My sense is this time around, we had 17 people, including a lot of accomplished individuals. We had 3 people who were complete outsiders, one of them a brilliant neurosurgeon, another one a CEO of a Fortune 50 company, the other one a celebrity TV star. We had 5 current or past members of the U.S. Senate, and then we had 9 past or current governors who had to make decisions that governors have to make. And I'm not certain how many of them, some of them came in well prepared because of the nature of who they were and how they operate, 2 in particular, ironically enough, both Floridians, but I'm not certain that anybody else in the pack approached this with this sort of concentrated attention to coming to understand what these things were, what they wanted to say, to test them, to subject them to the test and scrutiny of other people who would candidly tell them the strengths and weaknesses of what they were saying and make certain it all fit together. And I think that's a weakness that has shown up in the contest ever since.
Good afternoon and welcome to Cleveland. I want to ask you about the media coverage and the polls. You always hear about Donald Trump and Senator Rubio, where if you go on Real Clear Politics and look at who can win for the Republicans, it's John Kasich. Why aren't the polls in the news media paying more attention to that?
Actually, all of the polls until recently showed that Kasich, Cruz, and Rubio could beat Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump couldn't. I mean, there have been 49 polls national polls since he got into the race. He leads her in 5, ties her in 2, and trails her in 42. In politics, we call that a pattern. But you put your finger on it. The attention, I saw a study last week that suggested that 60% of all of the time devoted on the 3 major networks and the major cable networks to coverage of the presidential contest was devoted to the coverage of one man, and 40% to the other 16 Republicans and the 3, now 2 Democrats. And I defy you to tell me who that 3rd Democrat was. Real quick now, who was he? Jim Webb. So, yeah, well, Martin O'Malley, I'm sorry, he was so unforgettable, he didn't even count. But is that an advantage to him? Yeah, even when they spell his name wrong or say it wrong, as long as they say his name right or spell it right, even if they say ugly things about him, it's coverage. And it's helped him dominate the primary process, and it's a sign of, there's a beautiful book, if you want to read about this, written in 1963 by Daniel Boorstin, The Image. It's a little short book, so it doesn't have the sex and violence of this book. But Daniel Boorstin, who was then later the Librarian of Congress, said, we live in an age in which the emerging nature of the modern media is going to place an emphasis on celebrity rather than substance, upon the appearance of information, of knowledge about an individual, as opposed to the substance of the information of their life experiences that they can bring to the job of the presidency. The subtitle of it is The Role of Pseudo-Events in American Politics. And it took it a while to get there, but we're exactly where Daniel Boorstin forecast we were, where we're more interested in, what do we know? I mean, look, Kanye West is thinking about running for president. Now, you and I may think that's a joke, but there are a lot of millennials who say, wow, wouldn't that be interesting? Because the cult of celebrity has taken on a hold in our society, that is really, really remarkable. We're electing people or supporting people who have no proven experience at being adept at the things that are required to govern. And Republican or Democrat, those skills are a necessity.
Coming to the City Club. I really loved your book. Could you talk a little bit about McKinley's efforts regarding getting black votes and his outreach toward black voters, and compare that to the GOP's efforts today to reach minority voters?
Well, what was interesting about McKinley is, first of all, this was a lifelong concern of his. When he enters politics in 1865, it is to support a comrade for the governorship, but also to support a constitutional amendment guaranteeing black suffrage in Ohio. And he is gravely concerned when Ohio voters turn it down 55-45. They elect his man Hayes as governor, his comrade, but they turn down this amendment. And this was something happened to him. He grew up as an abolitionist, but something happened to him in the war that convinced him of a sincere commitment, made a sincere commitment for his entire life to the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So this was an important cause for him. In 1884, he becomes a star in the Republican Party, in part by taking on an effort by the Democrats, led by a congressman from Kentucky, to, in essence, defund any protections for black voting rights in the South, to remove any federal protections to monitor voting fraud in the South. And he takes on this effort and literally becomes, almost overnight, he's a junior member of the U.S. House. In his third term, he's about ready to be tossed out, which is something else I learned that was interesting. In the Gilded Age, if your party lost the control of the House and you had won re-election by a narrow margin, you were routinely tossed out. An election challenge would be placed before the Elections Committee, and you'd be voted out. McKinley wins re-election in his swing district in 1882 by 7 votes. So it takes a little while, but the Elections Committee tosses him out. And he's tossed out shortly after he's taken on this fight on the floor of the House, and it makes him a national star. And even though he has just been thrown out of the Congress and is only in his third term, he's made chairman of the important, powerful Platform Committee, the Resolutions Committee at the 1884 convention. And this is a sincere belief of his throughout his life. Now, Republicans in the South depended upon black votes. The Republicans in the South were 20, 30%, depending on the state, white, and the rest of them were black. And as a result, they had half of the delegates necessary at the National Convention to nominate somebody. Never, after 1896, we get no electoral votes in the South because the black vote is being wiped out. We have 4 states in 1896 where there is a black majority: South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. A majority of men aged 21 years or older are black. Therefore, they should have voted Republicans, but the Republicans get less than 25% in every one of those states. Because after 1868, there is no election in America in which there is not systematic violence conducted involving murder and threats of violence and threats of disruption aimed at black and white Republican voters in the South. I mean, hundreds are killed over this period of time for the simple right to exercise their franchise. And McKinley feels keenly about this. In March of 1895, he begins to run his primary campaign. He's the first modern primary campaign. He's the first candidate who runs for the presidency in the way that we now take for granted. Before him, you said, I'm interested in being president, but I'm going to leave my fate in the, quote, hands of friends. And they sort of organized your state, got some friends in other states, showed up at the conventions, made deals, promises, patronage, cabinet posts, and settled it. McKinley says, I want to walk into the convention with a majority. So in March of 1895, he goes to the South. And he's not going to get the Southern support by the typical way of making promises and bribes and money. Just not going to do it. He said, I do not want to go to the White House mortgaged. So he does it differently. He goes to a small town in southwest Georgia that is the Palm Beach of the time, Thomasville, Georgia. And he stays there for several weeks, and it's on 2 rail lines, one east and west and one north and south. So they invite Southern Republican leaders to come and visit him. And until this book, we didn't know exactly who came. But I went and checked the hotel registers and found out who came to see him. Not all of them, but some of them. went to the little local newspaper that nobody had ever gone to and looked diligently through all the articles for every day that he's there and found, the local reporter said, well, we saw Reverend so-and-so at the airport, at the rail station, the well-known Republican activist from Savannah. And he brought all these people together and said, I'm running, and I want you to be with me, and I'll be your friend, and I won't forget you. And then he goes he's on vacation, so he goes to Jacksonville, Florida, St. Augustine, Florida, and Jacksonville, and then makes his way up to Washington, and something happens on the way. He goes to Jacksonville. And the white Republicans say, we're glad to have you here. We got this lovely reception for you, but we're going to warn you, don't get too close to the black element in the party. We need their votes, but don't hang out with them. And this offends McKinley. And the word gets out to the black Republicans, led by the state party secretary, Reverend Lee, and they say, we demand a meeting with you. And McKinley sends his cousin and a traveling companion to visit with him, and the answer is, of course we'll meet with you. And the next morning, something happens that has never happened in American politics before, and that is a candidate for the presidency openly meets with a group of black voters and asks for their support. 40 men, led by the manager of a local tree farm, troop into the St. James Hotel to meet with William McKinley. And they have a splendid meeting. And it's never happened before. And it's happening not in the North, it's happening in the Deep South. The next day, he does something that has never been done before. He goes to a black church in Savannah, Georgia, and hosted by the president of the Georgia College for Colored Youth. He speaks at an open meeting in a black church in Savannah, Georgia, and it's never happened before. No Democrat, no Republican has ever done this before, and there's McKinley doing it. And it's one of the reasons why at the Republican National Convention, which is sort of the biggest interest group in the country, is a virulently anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic group called the American Protective Association. McKinley takes them on by, at the Republican Convention, decreeing that the first day's invocation will not be given by a Protestant minister, it will be given by a rabbi. And the second day, he decrees that the invocation will be given by a Protestant minister, but from the AME church. And this was important to McKinley. And it really is an important moment in American politics that I think has been unheralded and unregarded. This is decades before anybody else does this in a political campaign. And he's the first to do it. And not in the North, where it's comfortable and easy for a Republican to be seen in the company of a black Republican. It's in the Deep South, where black men are being killed for saying that they have the right to vote.
I did a little bit of research before we had to come, and I saw that you were
Extra
part
credit.
Thank you. I saw that you were part of the Board of International Broadcasting. I was wondering why that wasn't talked about any. I find journalism a huge part of being a writer. So could you elaborate on what you did with them?
Yeah, I was on the Board for International Broadcasting that oversaw Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. These are the radio services that broadcast into the former Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. And I was on a fantastic board. Our chairman was Steve Forbes. It's something to fly into Moscow the night that the Soviet Union falls and you're flying in on the Forbes magazine capitalist tool jet. It was a fantastic board. It had the Catholic philosopher and Michael Novak. I got to serve with the former head of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, who was a marvelous human being. I was the young guy on the group. But it was and we had an important moment. This is when the Soviet Union is collapsing, and financial support from the Congress is being undermined, and we had to make a terrible decision as to whether or not were we going to continue this important source of free information behind the now former Soviet Union, behind the former Iron Curtain, or were we not? And in order to save it, we had to shut down the radio's historic home in Munich and move it to Prague. And it still operates today. And it is amazing. I'll never forget, we were in Moscow for the 60th anniversary of Radio Liberty. Which, think about that. We're in Moscow celebrating the 60th anniversary of a radio service that broadcast into the Soviet Union the voice of liberty and democracy. And we were there. We were in magnificent, the Writers' Union in Moscow. So if you wrote the 1954 infantry training manual, you were a member of the Writers' Union, could get a nice meal and have a nice place to stay when you came to Moscow. The apparatchiks stayed there, the nomenklatura, the elite. the ordinary Russian couldn't get in the front door. So we held our birthday celebration there, and all of them were there, all the dissidents. Elena Bonner, Sakharov, they were all there. It was amazing to see these people who had given and suffered so much for an idea, the idea of democracy and freedom. And we were celebrating with them the radios. And at the end of this wonderful evening, Gorbachev shows up to toast the radios and thank us for our efforts and so forth. And at the end of the evening, the cooks asked for a moment. They asked if they could make a presentation. And out of the kitchen came all these little babushkas about this tall, who, it turns out, for 50 years had had a secret shortwave radio that they kept hidden in the kitchen. And after the apparatchiks left, they would pull out their radio and listen to the voice of freedom. And they came out with this giant cake that they had saved up flour and sugar to make for us. And on top of it was a spun statue of liberty, the symbol of Radio Liberty. And it is a powerful, to me, reminder of what this idea that we take for granted so much, this idea of free expression as exemplified in the City Club, it has not been shared until recent by many people, and still is not shared by many in this world. And yet, if we talk about it and we share with people the promise of freedom, how powerful it is to the human spirit, how natural it is for people to say we deserve and desire to live free, not to live in slavery and servitude. It was a really great moment. I really enjoyed my service on it, and I don't know how I ended up there, but it sure was a heck of a lot of fun.
Welcome to Cleveland. What do you think McKinley would make of Donald Trump, and what do you make of Donald Trump?
Well, I can't speak for the Major, but I can tell you the Major is an unusual guy. First of all, he is not the normal member of Congress. He did his homework. He didn't rush to speak. He absorbed as much information as possible. And when he spoke, as a result, people listened. He makes his maiden speech in the Congress in 1877, late 1877, and early 1878. And when he does, the effectiveness and the force of what he says is so powerful that even as a freshman, he begins to gain enormous respect. The Republican leader of the Ways and Means Committee, Pig Iron Kelly of Pennsylvania, says, my God, this is a remarkable young man. And so by his sophomore term, he is seen as one of the architects and one of the leading voices for Republicans on economic policy. And it's not only Republicans who admire him. When he is kicked out of Congress in 1884, 7 Democrats break party ranks and vote to keep him in. This is not heard of. When we kicked them out, it was all of us versus all of them, and their guy went. When it was us being kicked out, it was all of them versus all of us, and yet 7 Democrats. And what is ironic is 6 of them, one of them is a junior member who's on the elections committee and thinks that this is complete fraud, that he's being kicked out. But 6 of them are senior Democrats who are his fiercest opponents on the issue of protection. These are the Texas free traders and the free trader element of the Democratic Party. They're their leaders. But they want to show their respect for the accomplishment of him as a legislator, so they say we should not throw him out. Roger Q. Mills of Texas, who later chairs the Ways and Means Committee, says, the man is a remarkable human being. He has done nothing wrong, and he deserves our respect. Thomas Brackett Reed once complained, he said my opponents in Congress go at me tooth and nail, but they always feel obliged to apologize to William before they call him names. And this was McKinley. And McKinley runs a campaign in 1894 that wins in large measure because he finds language. His opponent sounds like Bernie Sanders. If you are not supporting him, you are a dupe of the money power. The idle holders of capital on Wall Street, the bloodsuckers and leeches of the money power are his enemies. He literally, when he leaves Lincoln, Nebraska to go give his acceptance speech in New York City, he says, I go into the enemy's country. And when this is a complete controversy. What do you mean? In Pittsburgh, he says, No one will stand closer to the enemy than he and who bears the standard of our party, meaning himself. And it's us versus them. And McKinley, first of all, he's not us versus them kind of guy. We're all in this together. That's how he wins the labor vote. He says, we should not pit labor against capital or capital against labor. Neither can succeed without the other. We will have prosperity return only when all are prosperous, not when only some are. He's not somebody who pits Protestant against Catholic. He's the governor of Ohio. He's won election by 20,000 votes. The largest interest group in America with 13 million supporters, supposedly, is the APA. Just before his re-election as governor, they call him up on a Friday and say, we have discovered that you have 2 Catholics as prison guards at the prison outside Cincinnati. You must fire them. We'll call you back Monday. They call him back Monday and he says, we do not have a religious test in our Constitution, and those Catholic prison guards will stay. And they say, okay, fine. You're not going to be on our voter guide for the fall. We're going to leave it blank. And he wins re-election. In 1896, they declare, you are the only one of the Republican presidential candidates who is unacceptable to us because you're soft on the question of popery. Your advisors are all Catholics, and you're soft on the Pope. And he takes them on head on and modernizes the Republican Party by emphasizing that our country is great because all are included, not because some are excluded. And when he runs for president, this note of national unity reaches its most poignant moment on October 9th of 1896. I want you to think about this. He fought in the Civil War. He fought in the Shenandoah Valley. He was nearly killed God knows how many times. He is the first Republican president or Republican presidential candidate to meet with an organized group of Southern veterans, which he does on October 9th. Early in the morning, 40 trainloads of men in gray butternut uniforms get off of the train in Canton, Ohio, accompanied by their families, 2,000 veterans of the Confederate Army in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns. They're met by the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic Honor Guard. The Northern veterans in their blue uniforms have an honor guard and a mounted escort, and the wives of the GAR have made a beautiful silk banner to commemorate the day. They take them to lunch at the Tabernacle and feed them lunch while they wait for a couple of additional, one more train of veterans to arrive. It was stopped by a washout, and so they're on their way, and they feed them lunch. And they give each Confederate veteran a pocket knife, and on it is engraved a phrase that is a favorite of McKinley's, drawn from Washington's farewell address. No east, no west, no north, no south, but a common country. They're all given badges. The badge is half blue and half gray. It has a red, white, and blue rosette at the top, and the same phrase appears on the badge, and underneath it is a chromolith of McKinley and his running mate, Garrett Hobart of New Jersey. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate veterans in front of the Stark County Courthouse form up with Union veterans, blue and gray units together, and led by bands and flags, march up North Market Avenue to McKinley's house. The streets are lined with thousands of people singing patriotic songs, and many of them openly weeping. This is a moment of national reconciliation. This has not happened since the Appomattox. There's been no moment where there's been such a sign of national unity. And they walk up North Market Street, they take their position on the lawn there at McKinley's home, and McKinley emerges from the house and speaks to them. And I've read all of his speeches from that fall. And you can tell the ones, they're all pretty darn good, but you can tell the ones where he is writing for the polity. He wants this reprinted in the local papers, so he's talking about, how manufacturing in Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania is, or he's speaking to the men from North Bend, Indiana. He's talking about the milleries and the tin factories and so forth. But this is clearly from the heart, and it's very short and emotional. He says sectionalism was surrendered at Appomattox, this idea that we are divided. If we ever have to fight again, he says, and God forbid that we have to, we shall fight as brothers under a common flag. And men are weeping. These grizzled veterans of the Civil War are openly weeping. 2,000 Confederates line up, make their way across the front stage, and shake the hand of the major. And then they are taken back, fed dinner, and as a thank you to the people of Canton, Ohio, the Confederate bands conduct a concert until midnight, when again, conveyed by thousands of people and an honor guard. They go to their trains and make their way back to Virginia. Now, that was McKinley. McKinley came up with that idea. McKinley said, I need to do this. We need to heal this rift that has existed for 31 years, and I'm the man to do it. Do we have a character on the stage today who could do that? Do we have a man whose entire spirit is driven by a sense of America is one great country because we are one out of many, and we will rise or fall together, and it is my job as a candidate for the presidency to emphasize how we can do this together. In a moment of deep despair for the country, 1 out of every 5, maybe 1 out of every 4 Americans is without a job. People are literally dying of starvation in the Midwest. People are deeply anxious about the future. The politics is bitter in a way that we cannot comprehend, and this man has the genius to say, it is my responsibility to unify the country. We need a guy like that today.
Assuming just for the moment that Trump receives the Republican nomination, as you know, about every 40 years there's a major realignment. Do you think if he either wins or loses by a landslide, this could be a major realignment in the Republican Party?
First of all, we have moments where we do have realignments, but I think that the realignment of 1896 occurs, and there are 8 lessons that I derive at the end. Some of those I think have to do with the fact that we had a realignment. First of all, McKinley took on big ideas. He won because he said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stand by the gold standard in order to return prosperity, and I'm going to stand by the protective system in order to create jobs, and here are the concrete things I'm going to do. And then he did them, and prosperity returned. He took on the strength of his opponent, the supposed strength. His opponent was the advocate of the silver standard. It was winning him public applause and appeared likely to blow up the Republican chances of winning the White House until McKinley found a way to take on that big issue and turn a supposed strength into a weakness by the way that he did that. McKinley also was a different kind of Republican who said, I've got to grow my party. I've got to bring people in. I'm in the business of addition, not the business of subtraction. So I'm going to bring in Catholics. He's the first Republican president ever endorsed by a member of the Catholic hierarchy. I'm going to not be just sort of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I'm going to bring to Canton, Ohio, the Bohemian beer makers and the Croatian miners and the Portuguese fishermen, sponge fishermen. I'm going to bring people to Canton to visit with me who do not show up normally at Republican efforts. I'm going to print up 250 million pieces of literature, 17 pieces of written material for every single voter in the election. And I'm going to print them in 14 different languages so I can make certain that the Norwegians and the Germans and the Jews and even those goddamn Swedes, that they can understand what my message is. And it's an exceptional effort. He wins also because he broadened the electoral battlefield. He wins states that the Republicans had not carried from the Civil War or won ever, because he mounted a strong effort in the border states. And he's a candidate of change, constructive, positive change, and emphasizes unity when he does so. And he runs a modern political campaign with all the intricacies, all the detail, all the components that need to be run in a campaign. Now, the question is there somebody in the race that's going to A, run a campaign like that, and then B, govern in that way? We don't know yet. But one party, you cannot have a period of disequilibrium like we have now, where the two parties are sort of right at each other's throats and nobody can gain an advantage and the political system looks broken, without at some point it shifting and one party gaining dominance. My gut tells me in this election, none of the likely candidates are people who can make that kind of permanent change. Somebody will win. We have to have a system in which produces a winner, but my sense is it's more likely to be, another election or two before we see another realignment.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a forum with Karl Rove, author and former Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to George W. Bush. Special thanks to our table sponsors, Baker Hostetler, Cuyahoga Community College, Porter Wright, and the Republican Party of Cuyahoga County. Student participation from Brecksville Broadview Heights High School was made possible by the Loeb Foundation. Our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan and the 9 Hotel. The sale of Mr. Rove's book, The Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters, is provided by a cultural exchange. We thank all of you for your support. Thank you, Karl Rove. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.